Nice to see you again on Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. The international order is undergoing dynamic upheaval through quarrels among traditional allies like the EU and the US, and due to the US withdrawal from many multilateral frameworks that are endangering the global free trade system. The forthcoming summit between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Finland could put more pitfalls in a relationship becoming more overtly rivalrous. So how does the US view these global patterns? What kind of items are listed in Russia's foreign policy agenda? And what does that mean on the global scale? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined by Kathleen Stevens in the first part of the program. She is the former US ambassador to South Korea. In the second half, I sat down with Andrei Kotonov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. Welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Let's look at the Helsinki summit meeting between President Trump and his Russian counterpart. What will be achieved?
Clearly, it's an important relationship. I think there's a lot of concern in the United States. I share it about the role that Russia apparently played in our election, and about some other activities that Russia has engaged in. So I hope, I don't know what I hope that these are concerns that are raised in the summit. But I also think, of course, we have a big agenda with Russia, and I hope that the President is prepared to engage on that agenda and to certainly try to build a relationship, a constructive relationship, but it has to be on the basis of a very clear-eyed understanding of what American interests are, and certainly when it comes to Korea, which we were talking about, that Russia also has not a decisive role, but an important role, and that there are other areas where hopefully we can also find some common ground. They have a lot to talk about. I have to say I'm a little bit concerned about how much will be accomplished, though.
This latest move of engagement with Russia has drawn fire from European leaders, from Brussels. The issue of Crimea, economic sanctions that should be maintained. A lot of the European politicians argue strongly for those economic sanctions. So do you think Russia will be brought back to G7?
Well, I think it's not only some voices in Europe, but also some voices, many voices within the American Republican Party, within the American Congress, within the United States, that also have concerns about how and when we move to improve certain aspects of our relationship with Russia, given its behavior and given some of the issues that we still need to work out with them. So I think President Trump will be well aware of those. He has seemed to have, frankly, kind of a certain eagerness to have a good relationship with Mr. Putin.
What's the driving force behind his intent to have a good relationship? Is that because of the power politics principles like Dr. Henry Kissinger, who called for equilibrium between major powers? And if we're going to go back to the so-called Cold War in Northeast Asia, certainly the United States is not willing to see a vast Euro-Asian continent controlled by ICO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and in that bloc, Russia and China played the leading role.
You know, it's very hard for me to get inside Mr. Trump's mind. He does not come, as you know, from a traditional establishment political or international foreign policy background. He's quite transactional. I think it's something it's difficult to ascertain in some ways what his primary objectives are in addressing the relationship with Russia, but it's certainly something that's widely discussed in the United States in political circles. I think as he has remained in office, he's heard a lot of the concerns, and I hope that he takes some advice from some colleagues within his own party and his own administration, and actually from his own very good ambassador in Moscow, who used to be ambassador here in Beijing, Mr. Huntsman.
Russian authorities as well as European politicians have been asking the same question as to why NATO is still kept alive despite the end of the Cold War. Eventually, who is the arch-rival of the NATO? Today, it seems there will be a strong possibility of a falling out between Germany and the United States, which urges European leaders to increase their military spending by up to 2% of their individual GDP. This is a huge political pressure for politicians in either the UK or continental Europe. What do you think of the future of NATO, and do you think NATO will have a second round of eastward expansion from former member states of a Warsaw Pact to the broad region of the Indo-Pacific area?
I personally doubt that we're going to see a further expansion of NATO in the short term. It's no secret, it's obvious that Europe is going through some of its own political challenges, and I think that's within the context of broader challenges to many of the institutions set up with the leadership of the United States in the post-World War II era. My own belief, maybe I'm just old-fashioned, is that those institutions have, broadly speaking, served the world well in providing security and a framework for prosperity for several decades. But I think we are in a period where those are being reevaluated. And we have a president who clearly also feels that there may be some ways in which we want to reevaluate it. I believe that there is still a role for NATO, indeed for the EU, as the Europeans decide, in terms of again, providing the kind of stability and framework that has kept Europe at peace, mostly at peace, for an unprecedentedly long period of time. And I think there were also many efforts to demonstrate that NATO is not directed at Russia. But instead, at the broader goal of building confidence, of building transparency, of building capability to address all of the global challenges that we face. And those challenges are changing. So I think we need to adapt them. I hope we do adapt them, but I would be hesitant to say that they should be gotten rid of. And I don't think that's where, if you look at, I know Mr. Trump says a lot of different things, but I think he understands that as well.
It is the European media that starts to raise doubts about the prospects of or resilience of NATO, with the negative impact of Brexit. Collective defense of the European Union has been put on the agenda of the Franco-German axis, whether they will play the leading role in forging their own defense. Do you believe it is time for Europeans to look after their own security concerns? After all, the United States, well, President Trump uses transactional skills, but after all, with the rise of populism, it seems we start to see signs of a new isolationism, since this is a spillover effects of George Washington's farewell speech, right, and neutral acts before the Second World War. Deplorables and white losers in the Rust Belt start the inward-looking attitude instead of interference, overseas adventures, and internationalism.
You know, I think, first of all, historically, the pendulum has swung back and forth in the United States between greater engagement in the world and a greater sense that we want to close in on our own big continent. Added to that is the fact that I think we are at a time, and it is not the U.S. alone, it's the entire world, at a time of stresses and strains, again, not only on the institutions set up in the post-World War II period, but the stresses and strains caused by some of the unintended consequences or less positive consequences of globalization. You know, globalization, free trade, open markets have delivered great benefits, I think, to the world. But they've also caused a lot of disruption. So I think it is a political task of our time to address those. Again, my approach would be not to use an American expression, throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to see what can be adapted and how we can work together. I know a big theme of this conference we're at is multilateral institutions. Well, NATO is a multilateral institution. It's a regional security mechanism, which has worked quite well. I spent some time in the Balkans in the 1990s, and that was a terrible war. NATO played an important role in stabilizing and ending that war, and stabilizing and bringing those countries, including one who's playing in the World Cup, Croatia, into a world of greater opportunity and prosperity and stability. Certainly there are going to have to be changes. Certainly the role of the United States is changing. But I think that we need to build on the success that we've had, but to adapt it to what are clearly new tensions, new challenges. And you're right, some of that has to do with alienation, populism, emerging nationalism, and so on. But I think we need the mechanisms to deal with. Is what we've been discussing at this conference. The idea of what security mechanisms, what economic mechanisms look like, how we can work together. That's the challenge for our time. So I think rather than say all the ways in which NATO has failed or some other institution has failed, to say how can we adjust and adapt it for the very, very clear and present challenges that we face now. And we also face a world in which the center of gravity has moved towards the Pacific. I've seen that in my lifetime. The transatlantic relationship is still very important to the United States. The Pacific relationship is in some ways, I don't want to say it's more important, but it's equally important. The engine of growth is here, in Asia, in China. We know that. A lot of innovation is coming from here. So we need to have a strategy that, as the United States, that takes that into account as well, as does Europe. So there's a lot to play for right now. It's an exciting time to be in diplomacy, to be in politics, and I hope that our political leaders and our institutions are up to it.
How do you forecast the prospects of the process of denuclearization since both sides, DPRK and the United States, start to show signs of hesitation, skeptical sentiments, as well as even some voices from the military in the Pentagon that they should resume the military maneuvers and to impose a further maximum pressure?
Well, I think we're at the beginning of this process. It's been only some weeks since the historic meeting between President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un in Singapore. It was a very unconventional meeting for an old-fashioned diplomat like me, top-down. So I think it's not surprising that the negotiations have not really gotten underway yet. So we've had our Secretary of State, Secretary Pompeo, make his third visit to Pyongyang in just a few months. When you think how kind of extraordinary that is, I think it shows a commitment on the part of the Trump administration to moving forward with this. I think what's lacking right now is, if I may say on the American side, and I'm not from the American government, is, if you like, a fully developed negotiating approach and team. I think that's going to be an approach that's going to need to include very close consultations with China, with South Korea, with others, Japan, Russia in the area, whether it's the six-party talks or not, close consultations. And I think we also have not yet seen from North Korea readiness to really get down to negotiations. But I think it's too soon to be pessimistic. It's very challenging. We've been down similar roads before, and they have resulted in great disappointment. For those of us who'd like to see not only a Korean peninsula without nuclear weapons, but
it is indeed
peace.
a process, Kathy, a long one, arduous journey of rediscovery and building trust. However, the DPRK does have very strong concerns on the following issues. One is whether there will be soon a peace treaty to be signed by all parties involved in the Korean War in the early 1950s. The second, any possibility for withdrawing American troops from South Korea, no joint military maneuvers, replacement of the THAAD missile shield programs. I mean, these are the issues that constitute the bulk of the worries of the DPRK leadership. Do you think there's any possibility each one of them should be addressed in a constructive manner, one by one, down the road of realism?
I think that all these issues, I mean, certainly the issues of a peace process, a peace treaty, economic support and assistance for the DPRK, security assurances, and the rest can and should be addressed. And my sense is that the Trump administration is ready to do that in the context of also, of course, addressing denuclearization.
Kathy, thank you so much for being this part of a meaningful dialogue at a defining moment for the future of the two major powers. Welcome back to our dialogue. We are happy to be joined here by Mr. Andrei Kotonov, a senior researcher of U.S.-China relationship, as well as Moscow-Beijing ties. Welcome to dialogue, sir.
Thank you.
What do you think of the deliverables or results coming out of the summit meeting in Helsinki between President Donald Trump and President Putin?
I think it is very important that such a meeting did finally take place, because it's not normal when you don't have a summit meeting between two major powers for a long period of time. However, I would be cautious in my expectations. I think that definitely, unfortunately, the relationship between the two countries is very complicated and is very difficult to manage. So I think that the best possible results we can count on is that this meeting will indicate a change of the trend in the relationship, that we will start gradually getting back to track and gradually restoring the relationship as it should be.
We see two processes of rapprochement at the same time. One was the summit meeting in Singapore between the DPRK and the United States on the issue of denuclearization. The other, in parallel, is a very dramatic summit that we were discussing in Helsinki. In both cases, President Trump is facing multiple challenges from within the establishment, those who seriously doubt whether Russia should be reliable, and there are those die-hard opponents of having a peaceful Korean Peninsula, also coming from within the establishment in the age of domestic politics of the midterm congressional elections, for example. When you say this will change the tone, set the tone for more dynamics in improving the relationship between Moscow and Washington, many others may seriously disagree with you.
Well, I would say that I hope for a change. I don't want to say that I'm sure that the change will take place. It is yet to be seen. And you referred to the meeting in Singapore. I think that the implications of the meeting already raise concerns about whether it is a breakthrough or not. And Trump is exposed to very harsh criticism back at home, but the administration itself is not united on its policy towards North Korea. I think that the same challenge we have in Helsinki. Trump needs a political victory, and he wants to get back home saying that I resolved major problems with President Putin, and from now on we will have cooperation. But definitely the devil is in details, and I think that the worst case scenario is that any agreements that Trump can reach with Putin in Helsinki will be watered down by his own administration, or these agreements can be sabotaged on the Hill, because we know that unfortunately in the US Congress there are many people who are very skeptical about any possible dialogue with Moscow.
Andrew, we don't care about domestic politics, the midterm elections, or whether he is enjoying more support from the electorate in Midwestern states, the power base of his presidency. We do care about whether there's a very special, very important strategic partnership between Moscow and Beijing will be divided by the proactive diplomacy of Washington. Obviously, they don't want to see Moscow and Beijing coming together so quickly. So what do you think of the alleged conspiracy by policymakers in the D.C. to divide and rule between China and Moscow?
I think that indeed there might be concerns on both sides, in Beijing and in Moscow, that Washington, D.C. would offer something so great to the other side, that the other side would prefer to align with Washington, abandoning these traditional friendly relations between themselves. But frankly, I don't know what Washington can offer Moscow that would be more important than the current partnership with China. China is simply much more important. It is
one thing is sure, Andrew. China is listed as a strategic competitor more threatening and scary than Moscow or ISIL. I mean, this does make a big difference. Whether it's a radical departure from their policy of engagement since 1978, I don't know. But
I think that in case of the United States, pleasure comes before business. To basically fight Russia is pleasure. To fight China is business. And I think that, unfortunately for us, for Russians, Russia has become an issue of the domestic political struggle in the United States. While China is not that much an issue, it might become, but so far I think that Russia is the opponent of convenience. It is easy to be hostile in Russia when you sit in Washington. To be hostile to China is very expensive, because you have to sacrifice. You mentioned Midwest, but look at soybeans producers. Look at American farmers who are likely to suffer.
Even Wall Street.
Oh, well, Wall Street, exactly. You know, China is too connected to the United States to mess with China. That's why even President Trump, though I don't know how it turns out in the end of the day, but even President Trump is relatively cautious. You look at the U.S. establishment, you look at U.S. experts on China, most of these experts are pro-Chinese, at least a large majority of them. However, if you take Russia, it's a very different ball game. I think that Russia is perceived by many in the U.S. political establishment is an affordable enemy. You know, the trade between Russia and the United States is almost negligible. There are no major Russian investments in the U.S. economy or the other way around. And they are used to having Moscow as the enemy. I think that in the long run, you are right. China will definitely emerge as the major competitor to the United States. And I think that the attention will gradually move to Beijing from Moscow. But so far, you take Washington Post, you take New York Times, and you'll find many, many articles about Russia, about Putin, about how bad his behavior is, and why Trump should be very cautious when he meets the Russian president in Helsinki. So I think that so far you can be reassured that no U.S.-Russian alliance, no U.S.-Russian partnership or alliance is looming on the horizon. It's not going to happen.
What do you think of the future of NATO? And do you think, first of all, NATO takes Russia as the public enemy #1 in their threat assessment since the end of the Cold War, and perhaps since you're taking back Crimea and assistance with the Assad government in Syria?
Well, you know, I think that when they don't know what to do, they do what they know. NATO countries face a lot of challenges today. You take international terrorism, you take uncontrolled migrations, you take populism inside. There are very many serious questions that NATO countries have to confront. Unfortunately, they don't know how to confront these challenges. They were not too successful in out-of-the-area operations. Look at the NATO operation in Afghanistan. Can we consider it to be a great success? Take some other experiments in North Africa, for example. Can we call them a major victory for NATO? So they are back to issues which they know. They have been created, educated, trained to confront a major conventional threat from the East. And I think that I don't want to sound condescending, but I think there are many people in Brussels who are very happy that we have this second Cold War with Russia, because they get back to their old manuals, they get back to their old maps of Europe. It is the environment which is familiar to them. I think it's unfortunate. I think it's something that will not help the NATO countries in the long run, but I can understand why they are doing that.
But I'm afraid mounting tensions based on mistrust between Russia and NATO members in continental Europe is one thing. Internal disunity is quite another. Look at the military spending upon the request of President Trump. Disputes flared up between the two sides across the Atlantic Ocean on trade, steel and aluminum, as well as military spending, to say nothing of the nuclear deal with Iran, climate change pact in Paris, These issues have caused serious concerns on the side of the European Union. What do you think of the solidarity?
Well, I think that definitely the solidarity is eroded. First of all, the transatlantic dimension of this solidarity, because right now the United States, under President Trump, considers security as a service, not as a function of the U.S. leadership, but as a service that the United States can offer.
Public service?
As not the public service. That's exactly
conditional
the point.
Service.
It's service. It's service which can be rendered for fees. You know, you want to buy security, fine. We have security. We are ready to, yeah, we can sell security to you. And if you look at, for example, Poland, they were arguably the first to respond to this new approach.
Let's say the current world order. That's my last question. It's a big question, of course. It calls into question the leadership of the United States, credibility of the leadership, and whether that's sustainable. What do you think of the resilience of the Chinese economy, and how close is China to the center stage? Is China ready? Is the European Union ready?
Well, I think that the most serious midterm danger that we face in the international system is that we will ultimately get back to global bipolarity, that it will be the United States against China. Not just economically, which we already see happening, but also politically and militarily. If the world goes bipolar, then each of us will have to make our choices. For example, Europe, it will have to decide. It will not be in a position to take middle of the road position. Russia will have to choose. It's easy for Russia to make a choice, because definitely if it has to choose between China and the United States, it would opt for China. But if it opts for China, and for example India opts for the United States, then we will lose our connections to India, which is not good. So I think that if we avoid bipolarity, if we maintain, you know, this more complex multipolar system, then probably gradually we can restore stability. But it's not going to happen tomorrow, and we all have to work very hard on that.
President Xi Jinping made it very clear over and over, China does not aim to challenge the world order. It does not aim to replace the current one, but we want to work with the members of BRICS or G20 to improve the flawed world order, economic and political alike. Thank you so much for your participation in this dialogue. I'm very appreciative of your insightful analysis.